A hush fell over the scorched courtyard of the Red Keep as the great lords of Westeros gathered in a loose semicircle around the remnants of the Iron Throne. The once imposing seat of kings was now a grotesque and half-melted reminder of the wars that had brought the Seven Kingdoms to their knees. Men and women alike bore the scars of recent battles. Splinted arms, bandaged heads, gaunt cheeks from countless sleepless nights. Some wore the weight of loss in their eyes, having seen family members cut down or castles ravaged in the name of uncertain loyalties. Across the yard, ravens circled overhead, as if uncertain whether peace was truly at hand or if more violence would soon be unleashed. It had been agreed that the days of a single monarch holding absolute power would come to an end. After years of strife, after the blood spilled by the Targaryens, Baratheons, Lannisters, Starks, and all the others, Westeros was weary. Its people were weary. The nobility, bruised by decades of power plays and illusions of grandeur, seemed at last ready to consider an alternative. The notion had begun as a seed in the mind of a maester, one who had studied the free cities and the histories of the Rhoynar, and it had blossomed in the battered councils of lords who saw no better solution. Let the great houses share power, it was said. Let them rotate the rulership of Westeros under a compact that bound each house in mutual obligation and kept them in check through a new, carefully shaped assembly. They called it a republic for lack of a better term, though it was hardly recognizable to the exiles from Essos who had witnessed the functioning of true free states. This was Westeros's own brand of governance, one designed to satisfy ancient feuds and new alliances alike. The Targaryen claim was all but broken in this new age. The Baratheon line, once crowned, had shattered under the weight of internal divisions and external usurpations. The Lannisters, for all their power and cunning, had spent most of their coffers and energies on wars that reaped only sorrow. The Starks had seen their people marched south and back again, always with coffins to show for it. The other lords, whether hailing from the Reach or Dorne or the Iron Islands, had likewise tested the metal of their swords against each other and found only smoke and ruin. They were all spent. A new path beckoned, if only they could seize it without turning on one another. So they gathered in the shadow of the Red Keep's battered walls to sign the Articles of Rotation, as it came to be known. A stark parchment with many wax seals, bearing the sigils of each great house and many more of the lesser houses, declared that the throne, now only a symbol, would belong to a different great house every 5 years. Each great house would send an elected representative, typically the head of the house or a chosen heir, to occupy the seat and govern in consultation with the Assembly of Lords, a new council that would meet twice a year to discuss pressing matters of the realm. The lords would retain their lands. The king or queen in rotation would reside in King's Landing or wherever they chose, though the practicality of the capital could not be denied, and be subject to checks on decisions of war, taxation, and lawmaking. A new era, an experiment in compromise, was about to begin. Those assembled offered no cheers. They affixed their seals in stony silence and with a cautious sense of relief. Maesters moved between them, verifying the final signing, while the gold cloaks stood watch. News that the wars were truly done, and that some manner of government had been decided, would ripple across Westeros by Raven. Common folk would take it in with disbelief. No more fighting, no more shifts in which lord claimed the throne, no more forced fealty to crowns that rose and fell in the span of a moon's turn. Some, especially in the north, doubted that such a system could last. But for the moment, in that courtyard, it felt like the only way to mend the tapestry of the realm. When the last seal was pressed into blood-red wax, the first in line to sit upon the newly crafted Republican throne, a simpler version of the molten chair, was Robb Stark, who had survived the harrowing events of past wars with fewer illusions about kingship. Much of the realm still recalled him as the king in the north, though that title was officially dissolved in favor of unity. Yet when the first 5-year term was discussed, it was widely agreed upon, even by the southern lords, that the north had paid the steepest price in the conflicts and deserved the symbolic first turn. Robb, his hair threaded with silver after so many battles, approached the seat that had been hastily assembled from the remnants of the old. No longer a twisted mass of blades, it was now a wooden throne, crafted from the oak of the Kingswood, inlaid with gold filigree. Behind it, the half-ruined Iron Throne stood like a monument to the past. A hush settled as he set himself upon it. In that moment, it was as though he felt the eyes of all 7 kingdoms upon him. He thought of his father's words, the ideals of duty, and the necessity of compassion in leadership. The cheering never came, but the hush was enough. They all listened for words of guidance that might herald a new dawn. He promised, with formality and humility, to protect the realm, to seek counsel from the assembly, and to respect the rotation system that had been so painstakingly hammered out. When he finished, a single cry of "Long may he reign" went up, not from a lord, but from a battered knight in the courtyard. The words sounded hollow. They were a relic of the old monarchy, but the sentiment perhaps carried. And so began the Stark regency, the first term of the rotating throne. Word spread quickly. Across Westeros, small folk and soldiers alike took stock of the new arrangement. In the north, the peasants of Winterfell were relieved that their liege lord was recognized at King's Landing for a set period of 5 years, giving them reason to hope that their region might finally recover from the ravages of war. In the Westerlands, some among the minor nobility bristled at the arrangement, suspecting a trick that might disadvantage them once they came to hold the throne. In the Riverlands, villages battered by countless invasions dared to hope that the new system would keep the major powers from tearing through their lands again. In the Iron Islands, the thralls and reavers muttered in their halls, uncertain how this republic would affect their way of life. The lords of the Reach and the Stormlands calculated how the next election might favor them. In Dorne, the Prince of Dorne grudgingly placed his signature upon the document, even as he quietly planned how best to leverage this new arrangement to secure Dornish interests. Within weeks of Robb Stark's ascension, the Assembly of Lords was convened for the first time. A broad circular table was set up within the Great Hall of the Red Keep, where tapestries had once shown the victories of the Targaryens but now hung in tatters. Lords and ladies from every corner of the realm came, escorted by retinues that camped outside the city walls. Each house was assigned a certain number of seats, proportional to their standing, though the greatest seats still belonged to the great houses. Newly appointed bannermen, lesser lords, and a handful of merchant representatives, though the last were often overshadowed, were also in attendance. Once they assembled, Robb stood at the head, gazing upon the circle of powerful men and women who had for so long only met on the battlefield. He was reminded of wolves among sheep, or lions ready to roar. To see them all in one room, forced to discuss matters peacefully, felt stranger than any dream. He cleared his throat, mindful that every eye was upon him. "Lords and ladies," he said, "the realm has bled. We have all lost. Family, friends, holdings, or the better parts of ourselves. Yet we gather today, bound by a promise that this bloodshed shall not be repeated. The war is over, and our children deserve better than what we have seen these last years." His voice held none of the booming confidence of a hereditary king. Instead, it was quiet conviction. "Let us begin to heal." The lords exchanged glances, and after a cautious moment, murmurs of agreement rippled around the circle. Lord Tyrion Lannister, representing his house, nodded gravely. Lady Margery Tyrell, newly ascended as the head of House Tyrell after her grandmother's passing, offered a small smile in support. Lord Gendry Baratheon, rumors of his parentage no longer in doubt, manned the seat of Storm's End with a sense of uncertainty as he looked around the table. Men like Yohn Royce of the Vale cast watchful eyes across the assembly, while Prince Quenton Martell, newly returned to Dorne to assume his rightful place, tapped his fingers idly upon the oak. Balon Greyjoy's heir, Victarion, had not come. Instead, Asha Greyjoy represented the Iron Islands, her hard gaze a reminder that the islands would not yield easily to dictates from the mainland. Their first matters were mundane but crucial. The realm's finances had been gutted by war, and the royal treasury was nearly empty. Crops had been left to rot in the fields. Roads and trade routes had been neglected. The crown's former debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos loomed large, threatening to destabilize any attempts at regrowth. Even now, the crown in its new iteration would need loans if it hoped to restore roads, protect trade caravans, or fund the city watch. Robb listened carefully to the suggestions around the table, aware that each house had its own interests at heart. The Lannisters, who still had considerable minds, albeit less productive now, were willing to put forth a sum, but not without conditions. The Tyrells could provide grain and agricultural support, but in return they wanted certain trade concessions and an official seat on the city council that oversaw the distribution of King's Landing's goods. The Martells wanted to be assured that their caravans through the Prince's Pass and the Boneway would be taxed fairly, or not at all. By the end of the Assembly's first session, a workable solution had been reached. The realm would take an official loan from the Iron Bank, co-signed by the great houses, so that each had a stake in its repayment. The state roads would be partially rebuilt under a committee drawn from each house, each responsible for a segment passing through their lands, with oversight from the newly appointed Master of Coin, Tyrion Lannister. It was a compromised patchwork, but it was more cooperation than Westeros had seen in living memory. Maesters scuttled about, transcribing the agreements into official charters, which Robb Stark stamped with the new royal seal, a dire wolf surrounding the seven-pointed crown that symbolized the realm. It was a small victory, but a testament to how things might proceed. In the months that followed, King's Landing saw a slow, methodical transformation. The once overcrowded slums still festered, but new shipments of grain from the Reach stabilized food prices. Fewer starving peasants meant fewer riots, which allowed Robb to reduce the heavy-handed presence of gold cloaks in the streets. The City Watch, freed from the need to quell constant unrest, focused on rooting out banditry. Seaworth shipping vessels from the Stormlands brought fish and salt to the capital, while ships out of Lannisport arrived bearing precious metals and newly minted coins. Even the Iron Islands tested the waters of legitimate trade, though the old reaving traditions did not vanish overnight. Blacksmiths and carpenters, out of work after the wars, found new tasks in repairing the city's battered walls and burned-out buildings. Robb Stark maintained a small northern retinue at the Red Keep, trusting men he knew well, while also employing some southern knights for ceremonial duties. He took the counsel of Maester Samwell Tarly, who had come to King's Landing at the suggestion of the Citadel to lend his experience with records and historical precedents. Together, they navigated the realm's immediate problems, issuing proclamations in consultation with the Assembly. It was nothing like the unilateral decree of past kings. Every measure required negotiation, with each great house offering input. More than once, old rivalries surfaced. The Lannisters and Tyrells still clashed over distribution of resources. The Greyjoys cast suspicious looks at the other lords. The Martells demanded autonomy, and the North resisted the meddling of Southerners who tried to influence the region's internal rebuilding. In spite of these quarrels, the new arrangement held. The knowledge that the rotating throne would soon shift hands forced the lords to approach compromise more readily. If they sabotaged the current king's efforts, they would merely inherit the same weakened realm when their turn came. Likewise, if they left the realm in good condition, they stood to gain benefits under the next rotation. The unspoken logic underpinned the success of the system. It was in everyone's best interest to keep Westeros stable. And so, after nearly 5 years of Robb Stark's regency, the realm was far from perfect, but at least it was not on the verge of another war. Near the end of that first term, as the snows of the north began to recede for a milder spring, King's Landing prepared for the next succession in the rotation. The Lannisters were scheduled to hold the throne next. Rumor had it Tyrion Lannister himself might ascend, though some said he would let his elder brother Jaime do it, if Jaime even wanted the duty. Jaime had lost much of his swagger in these latter years, weighed by regrets and his missing hand. Cersei Lannister, who had once tasted power as Queen Regent, was nowhere to be seen in these assemblies, rumored to be living in the Westerlands, bitter and sidelined by the new order. Yet no official announcement had been made, which only fueled speculation in the capital. The question of who would represent House Lannister under the rotation loomed, adding tension to the day of the official handover. The day arrived at last, a crisp morning in King's Landing with a pale sun shining through scattered clouds. The great houses and their retinues, accompanied by lesser lords, filled the throne room. The wooden throne had been refurbished with new gilding, the dire wolf replaced by the sigil of House Lannister on its crest in anticipation of the next occupant. Robb Stark entered the hall, his cloak of gray wool trimmed with northern fur. He carried himself with the tempered grace of a man who had borne the burden of leadership for years. At his side walked Sansa Stark, who had served as a diplomatic presence in the capital, bridging the gulf between north and south with cautious politeness. The hush that fell over the hall was reminiscent of the day the Articles of Rotation were signed. Now, 5 years on, the hush carried a different flavor. Not fear, but guarded hope. Tyrion Lannister, master of coin and renowned for his sharp mind, stood before the throne, hands clasped behind his back. Jaime was by his side, stiff and regal despite his discomfort in crowds. Robb Stark inclined his head toward them. "Lords and ladies, it has been 5 years since we began this experiment. I have done my best to govern fairly and to enact the will of our new assembly. I relinquish the throne now as agreed to House Lannister." It was a formality to recite these words, but they were significant. They confirmed the realm's commitment to an arrangement that had no historical precedent in Westeros. Robb gestured for Tyrion to ascend. Tyrion moved forward, the soft clink of his boots echoing on the stone floor. At the foot of the dais, he paused, taking in the faces around him. Lords, ladies, knights, and courtiers peered at him, some curious, some wary, some openly hostile. Yet no one drew a blade. Tyrion's mismatched eyes reflected a calm acceptance as he stepped up to the throne. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then sank onto the seat. It was a stark reversal of old traditions. A Lannister ascending the seat not by conquest or marriage, but by the structured consensus of all the great houses. A ripple of whispers spread, then died as Tyrion cleared his throat. "I can't say I ever imagined this," he said, wry humor softening his tone. "But I am honored to serve as the second king under the Articles of Rotation. May we continue to rebuild our realm with the wisdom we have gained from so much tragedy." Not everyone clapped, but there were murmurs of assent. House Tyrell, standing off to one side, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Prince Quenton Martell crossed his arms, expression unreadable. Gendry Baratheon leaned forward slightly, as though trying to glean some clue about how this next administration might shift the balance of power. Robb and Sansa both inclined their heads, stepping to the side, making space for the new occupant. Now began the Lannister term. Tyrion, now styled as His Grace Tyrion of House Lannister, kept many of the structures established under Robb Stark. The assembly still convened. The regionally allocated committees remained intact. But Tyrion's nature as a solver of puzzles manifested in the changes he introduced. While master of coin, he had noted the realm's reliance on external loans, so his first priority as king was to stabilize the crown's finances. He collaborated with the Iron Bank, leveraging Lannister cunning to negotiate more favorable terms. With House Tyrell's backing, he set about standardizing tariffs on all seaborne trade coming into King's Landing. At the same time, he offered tax incentives to encourage the free flow of grain and other supplies across the realm. This drew the ire of some northern and Dornish lords, who felt they were being saddled with additional burdens. But Tyrion argued that, in the long run, a stable economy benefited everyone. Gradually, he rolled out a new currency minted by the crown, smaller coins for everyday transactions, so that peasants wouldn't be forced to rely on clipped or foreign coins. It was a novel idea, one that caused confusion at first. But the Lannister lion stamped on each coin was a reminder of who sat the throne, and also that the new monarchy was forging a distinct identity. All the while, Tyrion dealt with the intangible burdens of leadership. He had to enforce laws and oversee trials, some of which dredged up old rivalries. The new system required that any lord with a dispute could appeal to the assembly, and if the assembly deemed the matter serious enough, the king would be called upon to mediate. Time and again, Tyrion found himself at the center of thorny feudal arguments. One day, it was a border dispute between House Tarly and House Redwyne in the Reach. Another day, it was a complaint from a minor northern house against an aggressive bannerman near the neck. On each occasion, Tyrion strove to be impartial, though his Lannister name sometimes cast a shadow of doubt over his rulings. He also had to contend with external threats. While the wars had ended, banditry remained a scourge. the Vale's mountain clans still raided unwary travelers. The Brotherhood without banners had splintered into rogue gangs in certain regions. In the Iron Islands, some discontented captains engaged in sporadic reaving along the western coasts. Tyrion pressed the Assembly to fund a more robust, realm-wide watch, an expansion of the Gold Cloaks, or some traveling policing force that could assist local lords. This proposal was met with lukewarm support. Many lords insisted they could handle banditry on their own, and bristled at the notion of a king's force in their territory. But given that the economy thrived more when roads were safe, a compromise was reached, establishing small contingents of traveling officers who coordinated with local lords for security. It was a step toward forging some sense of a unified realm, albeit a realm that was still deeply divided by centuries of separate rule. If the first years under Robb Stark had been about healing the wounds of war, Tyrion's years were about shaping a vision for Westeros's future. He established committees that studied the feasibility of dredging new ports, improving farmland irrigation, and introducing fairer systems of taxation. Maester Samwell Tarly, invited to continue his service, eagerly helped gather knowledge from the Citadel regarding old land grants and the potential for improving yields in war-ravaged areas. Asha Greyjoy came and went from the capital, pressing for greater autonomy for the Iron Islands. She wanted the crown to acknowledge the Ironborn's right to raiding as part of their cultural practice, an obvious conflict with everyone else's desire for peace. Instead, Tyrion negotiated a series of maritime charters with her, allowing the Iron Islands to engage in limited adventuring against foreign coasts and to maintain a small fleet for self-defense. This, too, was met with reluctance by other houses, but Tyrion was cunning enough to realize that ignoring Ironborn traditions entirely would only breed more discontent. In his personal life, Tyrion found the throne a lonely seat. His nights were spent poring over ledgers and reading raven letters filled with complaints, threats, or pleas. Jaime, still adjusting to life with one hand, occasionally sat with him, reminiscing about better days or bemoaning Cersei's self-imposed exile. Sansa Stark had returned to Winterfell, though she visited the capital occasionally as an ambassador for the North, and she carried herself with a new poise that reminded Tyrion of how much had changed since they were forcibly wed in darker times. He had the support of a handful of counselors. Bronn, now Lord of Stokeworth, served as a blunt instrument when necessary. Lord Varys, ever the spider, hovered in the background, offering cryptic insights. It was, in many ways, a rule overshadowed by caution. Everyone was waiting to see if House Lannister would try to seize more power than was granted, or if they would respect the rotation system when their 5 years ended. Predictably, the end of Tyrion's term brought fresh anxiety. Would he relinquish the throne without a fight? Had he built alliances to cling to power? But as the day for the next rotation approached, Tyrion made no moves to defy the articles. Instead, he prepared to pass the scepter to the next house in line, House Tyrell. Margery Tyrell, widely regarded for her political savvy, had already made a show of humility by touring war-ravaged villages and doling out alms in the name of the Seven. She arrived in King's Landing wearing green and gold, accompanied by an entourage of reach knights and ladies whose wealth seemed to glisten in every thread. The city's small folk watched their procession with hopeful eyes, recalling how Margery had once been beloved by them during her brief time as queen consort under the old regime. A quieter but no less tense ceremony took place in the throne room. Tyrion rose from the seat, carefully stepped aside, and invited Margery to ascend, bestowing upon her the seal of the crown. She received it gracefully, smiling in that warm, practiced way that put courtiers at ease. A flourish of trumpets announced the new queen's reign under the rotating throne. Thus began the third term of this nascent republic. Margery quickly set about cultivating goodwill. She decreed public works projects in King's Landing, employing laborers to clean the city's gutters, refurbish crumbling buildings, and expand the public gardens. Many suspected these gestures were a bit too performative, but they had tangible benefits. The city became cleaner, safer, and somewhat more hospitable. She also invested in the roads linking King's Landing to the Reach, making the route safer for trade, an obvious boon to her homeland. Diplomatically, she hosted lavish feasts and balls in the Red Keep, inviting lords and ladies of every region to mingle. Musicians from the Westerlands played alongside Dornish dancers. Northern storytellers enthralled onlookers with old tales, and iron-born sea shanties filled the air. Beneath the glittering lights of these feasts, alliances were formed, deals were struck, and House Tyrell's influence spread quietly and thoroughly. Where Tyrion's reign had been defined by caution and policy, Margaery's was marked by charm and spectacle, though she remained politically shrewd in all her dealings. Not everyone was enamored of her style. Certain northern lords grumbled about the extravagance of her feasts when so many in the north still struggled to rebuild. Dorne watched with narrowed eyes, uncertain if her warm gestures were genuine or a means to overshadow Dornish influence. Asha Greyjoy found the parties a nuisance, preferring the sea's salt tang to the perfumed air of the Tyrell court. Gendry Baratheon, who had grown more confident in his role, attended some gatherings but felt out of place among the refined courtiers. Nonetheless, Margaery's approach succeeded in winning over many of the capital's middle-tier lords and knights, who appreciated the chance to celebrate after years of gloom. One of her more lasting contributions was the push for cultural exchange between regions. She sponsored traveling troops that toured Westeros, performing plays that glorified the realm's new unity. She funded small libraries in major towns, encouraging maesters to transcribe histories and share them widely. She even instituted a yearly assembly of scholars, inviting maesters, septons, and learned men to convene at Highgarden and discuss matters of knowledge, medicine, and the arts. These soft power initiatives slowly began knitting Westeros together in a way that swords never had. For all the cynicism in the upper echelons of nobility, Margaery's approach started to bear fruit among the common folk, who began to see themselves as part of a single realm, however uneven that realm might be. Her term, like those before it, was not without conflict. In the latter half of her reign, tensions flared with Dorne when Dornish merchants complained that Tyrell-sponsored caravans were gaining an unfair advantage along the southern routes. Margaery's council tried to placate Prince Quenton Martell with new trade guarantees, but skirmishes still broke out between Dornish outriders and Reach merchants. The Ironborn tested the limits of the maritime charters established under Tyrion, leading to a confrontation off Fair Isle where a handful of Ironborn longships clashed with Lannisport galleys. The resulting standoff was settled diplomatically, but it left blood in the water and fresh grudges ashore. Worse yet, pockets of lawlessness cropped up in the Riverlands, where feuding minor lords took advantage of the crown's softer stance. Margaery responded by dispatching her new network of traveling officers, but some saw it as an overreach of her authority. The old tension between a central seat of power and the autonomy of lords reared its head, reminding everyone that Westeros was still a tapestry of competing interests. By the time Margaery's 5-year term ended, much of King's Landing sparkled anew. Flowers adorned arches, wells were cleaned, streets were paved or at least improved, and the Red Keep staff wore more refined livery than before. She had, in her own words, brought a garden to the city. The effect on the realm's stability was a matter of debate, but no one could deny that the capital had never looked more resplendent. And so, as with her predecessors, the day came for her to step down. The next in line was House Martell, a testament to the realm's attempt at inclusivity, as Dorne had long been the most independent of all the regions. Prince Quenton Martell traveled to King's Landing amid a swirl of expectation. He had inherited the mantle after the passing of his father, Doran Martell, and while he lacked the fiery reputation of his sister Arianne or the cunning of the late Ilaria Sand, he was widely considered a tempered, measured man. He was accompanied by a retinue of Dornish warriors, their spears shining in the sun, and a cadre of elegant courtiers who brought the colors and flavors of Sunspear into the heart of King's Landing. Margaery yielded the throne with a gracefully worded speech, praising the spirit of cooperation. In return, Quenton gave a brief address that emphasized Dorne's long-standing history of pride and independence, and how he intended to use his time on the throne to ensure that all regions, especially those far from the center, were treated equitably. Quenton's first moves were careful. He recognized that Dorne had no direct interest in dominating the north or interfering with the concerns of the Westerlands or the Vale. Instead, he focused on bolstering the trade routes that cut through the Red Mountains, opening new markets for Dornish wines and spices. He also sought to ensure that the crown recognized the unique traditions of Dorne, especially in matters of inheritance and the role of women in leadership. This placed him at odds with some conservative lords who still clung to the undulled traditions codified by the faith. Yet Quenton's steady approach, and his willingness to negotiate each point in the assembly, mollified many who might have bristled at Dornish demands. Under Quenton, the realm saw a slight shift in focus southward. Ports along the southern coasts were fortified against piracy. Joint patrols with the Stormlands were introduced to protect shipping lanes from Lysine and Myrish privateers. Quenton sponsored caravans that traveled across the continent, encouraging them to trade not just in Dorne but also in the Crownlands and the Vale, fostering a sense of interdependence. He also quietly continued some of Margery's cultural initiatives, inviting minstrels from Dorne to perform in the capital, holding small festivals that showcased the region's distinct customs. Many lords from other regions found Dornish hospitality surprisingly pleasant when experienced in the relative safety of the capital. The spearwives who guarded Quenton drew attention, some negative, some admiring. Nevertheless, Quenton maintained a stoic calm in the face of any insinuations that Dorne was a foreign land within Westeros. Tensions arose when a winter storm battered the northern coasts, causing a famine in certain parts of the north. The question of relief funds became pressing, as the crown's coffers were still recovering. Quenton proposed a measure that allocated money to help the North rebuild its granaries and purchase emergency grain from the Reach. The measure passed the assembly by a narrow margin, with the Lannisters complaining that it taxed the gold mines of the Westerlands disproportionately, and the Tyrells grumbling about price controls on their grain shipments. But it stood as evidence that the realm was beginning to function collectively, at least in some respects. That winter crisis, though severe in certain pockets, was not allowed to spiral into mass starvation, as it might have in earlier years when the North was left to fend for itself. Over time, Quenton's measured hand won him a degree of respect. He was not as dazzling as Margery, nor as cunning as Tyrion, nor did he hold the moral gravitas of Robb Stark, but he steered the realm steadily. His biggest challenge came near the end of his term, when the Iron Islands, long restive, put forth a proposal that reaving be formally recognized as part of Ironborn culture, and that they be exempt from crown interference. The assembly bristled at the suggestion. Asha Greyjoy, who spearheaded the proposal, argued that reaving was how the Ironborn claimed their place in the world, ensuring they were never subjugated. Robb Stark, now once again in Winterfell, wrote a letter warning that such a policy would lead to more conflict with coastal regions. The Tyrells threatened to blockade trade routes if the Ironborn were given free rein to raid the Reach's coasts. Tensions rose, and some worried that old animosities would boil over into outright war. Quenton Martell found himself mediating a bitter standoff, reminding everyone of the fragile peace they had built. After much negotiation, a compromise was reached. The Iron Islands could engage in foreign adventuring under strict guidelines that forbade them from raiding the shores of Westeros itself or allied territories. Moreover, the spoils of any raids would be taxed upon return to Westeros. Asha Greyjoy accepted these terms grudgingly, viewing it as a half measure, but it allowed the Ironborn to maintain the veneer of their old ways while staying tethered to the new structure. When Quenton's term finally ended, he relinquished the throne with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his reign. The next rotation was scheduled to go to House Baratheon, a development that caught many by surprise. House Baratheon had been all but extinguished during the wars, but Gendry's recognized claim, and the support he had gained in the Stormlands, had revived it enough to grant them a seat at the rotating table. The day he ascended the throne, Gendry looked visibly uneasy, despite having spent months, if not years, preparing himself. A black stag crest replaced the sun and spear of Dorne on the wooden seat, and the combined banners of the crown and the Stormlands hung from the rafters. Gendry was no orator. He stumbled through his first official address to the assembly, admitting openly that he had neither the political savvy of the other lords nor the inherited knowledge of an old lineage. But he spoke from the heart about his desire to see justice done, to honor the spirit of Robert Baratheon without repeating his father's mistakes. Some in the hall smirked at his lack of polish, but others found it refreshing. An honest man among a room of seasoned schemers. Gendry's reign turned out to be a curious blend of modest reforms and common sense. He relied heavily on the council around him, especially the Maester Tarly, Brienne of Tarth, who served as a sort of advisor on matters of knighthood and justice, and a handful of Stormland lords who guided him through the complexities of governance. His focus was on security, ensuring that banditry was reduced and that the small folk felt the crown's presence in a positive way. He also took a personal interest in forging a better future for orphan children, remembering his own uncertain childhood in Flea Bottom. Under his watch, funds were allocated to establish orphanages in major cities, along with basic schooling sponsored by the faith. This garnered surprisingly broad support, as even lords recognized the value of educating the populace to some degree, especially in an era where knowledge was slowly becoming more accessible. Gendry's earnestness won him allies where cunning might have failed. However, he was not spared the usual challenges of the throne. A trade dispute erupted with the Free Cities, the Vale's mountain clans raided newly built roads, and the Greyjoy question never fully went away. At times, Gendry's frustration surfaced, and he would pace about the Red Keep's courtyards, muttering that he was a blacksmith thrust into the role of king. But he stuck to his duty, forging alliances through sincerity rather than intrigue. All the while the realm watched, the small folk had grown somewhat accustomed to the rotating throne. Every 5 years, new banners flew above the Red Keep, new officials arrived, and a new house took the lead, but the underlying structures, the assembly, the committees, the regional autonomy, remained. Some found the constant change disconcerting. Others, especially merchants, realized that the cyclical shift presented opportunities for negotiation and profit. The great houses, despite their wariness, came to see the rotation as a way to ensure that no single house could dominate the realm without check. Intrigues still abounded, but they were less likely to manifest as open warfare, more likely to be settled in the halls of council or in carefully worded treaties. It was an imperfect peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Looking back over the span of these rotations, one could see how Westeros was quietly evolving. The scars of war had begun to fade into memory for a new generation of children who had never known a single king or the absolute rule of one dynasty. They knew only that their father's father had lived in a time of dragons, or a time of Baratheon kings, or a time of war after war. Now, they saw different flags over kings landing every few years and heard stories of how the realm was governed by a council that all the lords participated in. Perhaps it was a fragile arrangement, one that might shatter under the weight of a future crisis. But for the moment, it held. As Gendry's term approached its end, the cycle prepared to return to the north, for House Stark to take the throne again. The question loomed: which Stark would assume the seat this time? Robb Stark, having served his 5 years, had returned north to focus on rebuilding Winterfell and had grown weary of the politicking in King's Landing. Sansa, shaped by her earlier experiences, seemed the logical choice. Her brother Bran, mysterious and withdrawn, was rumored to be more interested in the arcane secrets of the Weirwoods than in ruling. Arya was off adventuring, hardly a candidate for the crown. Rickon Stark had grown into a robust young man but lacked the political acumen of his elder siblings. By the time the official announcement was made that Lady Sansa would ascend as queen under the rotating throne, the realm had accepted it with a nod of inevitability. And so, the turn of the wheel came round again. Gendry Baratheon stood in the throne room on a cool morning, transferring power to Sansa Stark. She walked forward in a gown of wolf-gray velvet, lined with white fur. She carried herself with quiet grace and the confidence gained from living through more horrors and intrigues than most could imagine. Her red hair was braided in the northern style, and she wore a small silver crown shaped like entwined direwolves, symbolic of the old traditions but tempered by a new reality. She sat upon the seat that had once been graced by her brother Robb, by Tyrion Lannister, by Margery Tyrell, by Quenton Martell, and by Gendry Baratheon. The circle continued. If one looked around that hall, they would see that the faces had shifted. Lords and ladies who had once seemed entrenched in hatred now found themselves seated at the same table. Alliances that would have been impossible in a monarchy had formed. Rivalries persisted, but they were less inclined to erupt into open war. The Red Keep itself bore the visible layers of each ruler's improvements or additions. A new wing of scriptoriums from Tyrion's era, a luscious garden courtyard from Margery's time, corridors refurbished under Quenton's watch, and a forge where Gendry had continued to practice his old craft. Now, Sansa would leave her own imprint on the keep, on the capital, and on the realm before passing the power on again. In the year that followed her coronation, she quietly focused on uniting the North and the South through a network of marriage alliances and fostering arrangements. She sponsored a large festival dedicated to the Old Gods and the Seven, inviting septons and worshippers of the Old Gods to celebrate side by side in King's Landing. She negotiated a mutual defense treaty with the Vale, strengthening the mountain passes against Durs. She also tapped into the diplomatic channels she had honed under Margery's mentorship, balancing the influences of the Tyrells and Lannisters, ensuring that none felt overshadowed by the other. Her style was patient, deliberate. When she spoke in the assembly, she did so rarely, but her words often carried weight. She had learned, after all, that knowledge and composure could move mountains where bluster and threats failed. Sometime into her reign, a rumor reached her ears that a Targaryen pretender had landed in the southern Stormlands, proclaiming themselves the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The news sent a tremor through the realm, stirring up old nightmares of renewed dragon claims. Yet the pretender was quickly revealed to be a charlatan, riding no dragons and commanding only a handful of mercenaries. The local Stormlords, mostly loyal to Gendry, quashed the uprising without much fuss. A few decades earlier, such a claim might have sparked civil war. Now, it was little more than a curiosity, a testament to how much the realm had changed under the Republic's rotating throne. In private moments, Sansa wondered if this fragile arrangement would outlast them all. She could see a future where the great houses continued their cyclical claim, each leaving a distinct mark on the realm, each forced by the structure to cooperate. She could also imagine a crisis, perhaps an external invasion from the east, or a resurgence of the White Walkers, or a cataclysm that required swift, united action. Would the realm be able to respond effectively without a single monarch at its helm indefinitely? Or would the cooperation they had fostered prove stronger than any one king or queen could ever be? She pushed these worries aside, focusing on the present. Word arrived from the north that the winter snows were receding, promising more bountiful harvests in the coming years. From the Westerlands came tidings that a new gold vein had been found, replenishing House Lannister's coffers. From the Reach, the Tyrells reported a record yield of wheat, thanks to new irrigation methods funded under Margery's term. From Dorne, shipments of fine wines and spices flowed steadily into the ports, their caravans traveling safely along roads once haunted by bandits. From the Iron Islands, a small fleet sailed forth under a new commander, seeking foreign shores to ply their brutal tradition. Yet, by the terms of the compromise, they left Westeros itself unmolested. The system, improbable though it was, functioned. On the streets of King's Landing, the small folk whispered that the new queen was kind but watchful, that her name was Stark but she wore silks like a southern lady, that she was more cunning than her gentle voice suggested. Some told stories of how she had once been betrothed to monsters and survived. Others said she possessed the courage of the North. As the days turned into weeks, she convened the assembly, hammered out trade accords, and mediated disputes. She held court for the small folk in a refurbished throne room that seemed friendlier, less oppressive than in the days of the Targaryens. It was a slow, methodical dance, and she performed it with a calm sense of purpose. During one of these court sessions, as she listened to a plea from a farmer about disputed land near the Trident, Sansa found herself recalling the heartbreak and horror that had once enveloped her family. She remembered the chaos that had reigned after Robert Baratheon's death, the blood spilled at the Red Wedding, the madness that had taken hold of the realm, leading to the War of the Five Kings. She remembered being a terrified girl in a world of lethal intrigue. Now, that world had been reshaped, not perfectly and not without scars, but it was better than endless war. And so the story continued, weaving through the daily life of a realm that had discovered a measure of stability in compromise. The great houses, each in turn, faced the burden of leadership, reaped the benefits of power, and shouldered the blame when things went awry. No single family was able to hoard the throne forever, and so no single family could impose a tyranny or risk open rebellion without considering that they, too, would eventually have to govern. Over the years, some houses thrived under the arrangement, others struggled, but all shared a vested interest in keeping the realm together, bound by the articles of rotation that had emerged from the ashes of civil war. Doubts persisted. There were always rumors of conspiracies, always a disgruntled lord who chafed under the new system, always a memory of how things used to be. Yet these storms passed, failing to gather the force they might have under the old system of absolute monarchy. The times when the great houses had waged war after war had left them too exhausted, too financially strained, to hazard another gamble of that magnitude. Moreover, the cultural cross-pollination, Tyrell harvest festivals in the north, Dornish caravans in the Westerlands, Stark-led councils in King's Landing, reinforced an emerging sense that Westeros was, if not one people, then at least one realm, bound by a single tapestry of laws, roads, and alliances. Even the faith adapted. The High Septon, once an ardent supporter of a single anointed king, gradually shifted doctrine to emphasize the unity of the realm and the blessings of the Seven upon the combined leadership. The Citadel, for its part, encouraged maesters to serve not just one lord but the realm at large, facilitating communication and knowledge sharing. Over time, pockets of resistance grew quieter, replaced by the daily grind of governance and local concerns. The question of who would take the throne next and how they would handle the realm's complexities remained an ongoing drama, a rotating stage where each great house took its turn in the spotlight. So it was that Westeros found a new equilibrium. The echoes of dragons and the glint of Valyrian steel lingered in the songs of bards and the stories told to children, but the present belonged to a cycle of compromise. Some whispered that the realm had lost its grandeur, that it no longer had a single ruler whose lineage stretched back to conquerors and kings of old. Others insisted that grandeur was overrated, that the realm was better served by many hands carrying the burden of rule. Still others predicted doom, believing no arrangement could hold together so many fractious factions forever. Yet for the span of these rotating reigns, first Stark, then Lannister, then Tyrell, then Martell, then Baratheon, and back to Stark, Westeros found something it had scarcely known since the first Targaryen conquest. A peace that lasted long enough for a new generation to be born, grow up, and begin to shape the realm in their own image. That generation might eventually decide that the system needed refining, or even dismantling. They might discover a new threat beyond the horizon, or an old threat lurking in the shadows of the past. They might tear down the articles of rotation or strengthen them further. But for now, they inherited the closest thing to stability that Westeros had seen in an age, built upon the notion that no single house should hold dominion over all the others forever. A principle that had once seemed unthinkable in a land defined by dynastic rule now stood as the cornerstone of the realm's fragile peace. In the end, the battered remnants of the Iron Throne still stood in the Red Keep, a molten sculpture of twisted swords and memories. It was left there as a reminder, cordoned off behind a velvet rope, an artifact of an older era. Visitors sometimes approached it with awe or took children to gawk at the melted blades. The real seat of authority was the wooden throne, replaced each rotation with the sigil of the house in power, symbolizing that rule was not an inheritance but a responsibility shared and passed along. And so it remained, as if the realm itself breathed. One house exhaled, another inhaled, and the kingdom endured, perhaps never fully united in love, but bound together in necessity, compromise, and the hope that endless war would never return. Sansa Stark, in a moment of reflection on a quiet evening, gazed upon the old, melted throne. She thought of the stories her father used to tell her about the Targaryen kings, about honor and justice, about the terrible price of power. She remembered how she once dreamt of being a queen in a storybook sense, standing next to a gallant king who would take her away from all worry. Life had offered a far more complex reality. Yet here she was, in a seat of power, shared power, ephemeral power, and her realm, despite its lingering problems, was not ravaged by war. That alone was a marvel, and she knew that when her time ended, she would step aside for the next house, leaving behind whatever legacy she could. It was no golden utopia, no grand romance, but it was a start, And in a land so often defined by bloodshed, even the start of something better could feel like a small miracle. So the great houses rotated the throne, and the story of Westeros continued, day by day, year by year, in peace.